This is Professor Upfer, and this is the second lecture on social cognition, in which we talk about attributional logic and failures to use this attributional logic. So in the last class, we saw that children seem to have developed a kind of theory of mind, a way of understanding people's reactions in terms of their beliefs and desires, a way of understanding people's actions in terms of their beliefs and desires, and a way of understanding people's beliefs and desires in terms of perceptions and basic emotions and physiology. So if we wanted to know why is someone angry, well, we would probably need to know something about what they believe and what they want. Broadly speaking, when you're making a claim about a person's behavior, why is a person, say, angry? What's the cause of their behavior? That's what social psychologists call an attribution. And there is a certain kind of logic to making an attribution. Right? So we might have to decide maybe whether a behavior is due to the person or due to the situation. And a professor at Ohio State, George Kelly, very influential social psychologist, in fact, one of the people who gave us the idea of a mentalistic conception of others, describes a kind of logic that we might use when we're trying to decide whether behavior is due to the personality or the situation. The idea is that we would first ask, does this person regularly behave this way in this situation? Do others regularly behave this way in this situation? And does this person behave this way in many other situations? So if, for example, you had an observation like Susan is angry while driving in a traffic jam, and you had to explain why is Susan angry while driving in a traffic jam, you might first ask, well, does Susan regularly get angry in traffic jams? If the answer is no, then you can't really attribute this either to her personality nor to the situation. But if the answer is yes, then you have to ask yourself, do many other people get angry in traffic jams? If the answer is yes, then you'd say that, well, that's because traffic jams just make people angry. Therefore, Susan, being a person, is angry. However, if the answer is no, that most people don't get angry in traffic jams, then you have to ask yourself, does Susan get angry in many other situations? If the answer is yes, then you might attribute this to some general personality characteristic of Susan. Maybe you'd say that she's just an irascible type of individual. On the other hand, if the answer is no, then you might make a particular personality attribution. Like you might say, oh, Susan must get angry in traffic jams because she really thinks this is an injustice to her personally. Okay. Now, although this sort of describes a fairly logical way of going about making attributions, we know that there are at least 6 influences on social cognition where Kelly's attributional logic fails rather badly. It's not really his logic that fails. It's that people fail his attributional logic. So the first thing that we often see is a kind of person bias. So the person bias, sometimes known as the fundamental attribution error, is that people give way too much weight to personality and not enough to situational variables. Sometimes known as the person bias or the fundamental attribution error. And there are certain conditions that promote the person bias. So if I ask what kind of person is Susan, all right, you're more likely to say, oh, well, she's an irascible type of person. When a person is cognitively loaded, so for example, if I ask a subject to work on the New York Times crossword puzzle, So that's a cognitive load. So now I'm really going to be able to think very deeply about my question. And I say, why did Susan do this? Your first reaction might be, oh, well, it's because she's irascible. There are also conditions that promote a situation bias. For example, when the goal is to judge the situation. This has given rise to an influential theory of attributions known as the two-stage model. The idea is that the first stage of making an attribution is rapid and automatic. And that's going to be biased according to the goal, whether it's to judge the person or the situation. But the second stage is slower and more controlled. This is where we might correct our automatic attribution. So maybe our first instinct is, oh, Susan is just an irascible person. And then we might think, although maybe most people would get angry in this kind of traffic jam, so maybe it's not really her, it's the traffic jam. But that second stage won't occur if a person is distracted, under time pressure, or is otherwise cognitively loaded. That's the theory. So the idea would be that if you see that Joe laughs hysterically while watching a TV comedy, if the observer's goal is set by asking the observer what kind of person is Joe, the automatic attribution is Joe laughs easily. But then the controlled attribution might be, well, it could be a funny show. But if you ask them, you set the person's goal a bit differently, you say, how funny is the TV comedy? Their first reaction, their automatic attribution, is that the TV show is funny. After all, Joe is laughing hysterically. But then you might have a second thought, which is, well, maybe the TV show isn't that funny. Maybe Joe just laughs really easily. That would be the controlled attribution. Now, there are some cross-cultural differences here. So in Western culture, where we see people as being in charge of their own destinies, we see generally more attributions to personality. In some Eastern cultures, where people believe that fate is in charge of people's destiny, you see more attributions to the situation. There's another factor that tends to explain our person bias, and that's visual perspective. Right? So we know that we tend to attribute personality causes of behavior when we're evaluating someone else's behavior, and we tend to attribute situational factors when we're evaluating our own behavior. Well, this might be caused by one of two factors. All right. Maybe, all right, what's going on here is that we know our own behavior changes from situation to situation. We have a first-person perspective on this, all right? But we don't know this about other people, right? If you only know Joe from laughing hysterically at this TV show, well, you don't know about all the other TV shows and whether or not he laughs at them. The other idea, though, is the visual orientation hypothesis. The idea here is that when we see others perform an action, we concentrate on the actor, not the situation. The actor sort of looms large in what we're attending to. But when we perform an action ourselves, we don't see ourselves. We see the environment, not the person, because you can't see yourself. So to test this, people sort of set these two hypotheses against each other by doing a pretty ingenious test. Right? This was a test done by Storms in 1973. One group watched themselves perform in a certain situation on tape. So they could see themselves now acting in a certain situation. And then the other group watched a film of the same kind of behavior, all right, from the other person's perspective. So they had like a head-mounted camera, so it was literally as if they could see through another person's eyes. And what they found is that the trait attributions were much greater for group A than group B. So here, even though people normally explain their own behavior by situation, all right, here they're explaining it based on their own traits. All right, that wouldn't be expected from the self-knowledge hypothesis. Also, when you looked at how often people attributed behavior to the situation, it was greater for group B than group A, meaning when you could see things from another person's perspective and the situation loomed large, then people were more likely to explain other people's behavior on the basis of the situation. All right, even more than explaining their own behavior. So this was total support for the visual orientation hypothesis and not at all support for the self-knowledge hypothesis. So it seems that part of the way that what we need to do to get to a more controlled attribution is literally by taking another person's perspective. And when it's made easy for us, like watching a film from another person's perspective, then we can sort of break the person bias. There are other, though, influences on social cognition beyond visual perspective. One is prior information. All right. So in the same way that we can have a schema of an island, right, we also have schemas of certain people, right, and this can affect our interpretation of them. In one of the studies that George Kelly did, students had a guest speaker come to class, and before the speaker came, half of them got a written biography with lots of information, but also mentioned that the speaker was very warm. And the other half got exactly the same biography, but mentioned kind of offhand that the speaker was rather cold. Right? Then, after the speaker had given this talk, the students were asked to rate the guest speaker. And what they found is that the ones who had gotten the bio saying that the speaker was very warm rated the speaker more positively than the rather cold group. Even though this is rather striking because both of them got exactly the same talk. What they saw with their own two eyes was exactly the same thing. And it was totally random who got which bio. So this is a case of where prior information, even a tiny little sliver of information, what's sometimes called a thin slice of information, can affect our interpretation. Another factor that can have a large impact on how we judge other people is their personal appearance. One thing that we see is what's known as the attractiveness bias. So across a whole host of positive traits, people who are rated as being physically attractive are also rated higher on intelligence, competence, sociability, and morality. Studies have found, for example, that teachers rate attractive children as smarter and higher achieving. Adults typically attribute the cause of an unattractive child's misbehavior to their personality, but they attribute the cause of an attractive child's behavior to the situation. It's also the case that judges give longer prison sentences to unattractive people, as if they think that there's something not in the situation that might be exonerating or at least mitigating, but something deeply bad about that person. After all, you can see how ugly they are. Now, this isn't at all in line with Kelly's attributional logic, nor is it really in line with the theory of mind. We don't say that a person is happy or sad or takes the actions they take because of how pretty they are. We say it's because of what they believe and what they desire. But apparently, when we see a pretty face, we are liable to hallucinate goodness. And that's not the only effect of personal appearance. Another kind of effect that we see is known as the baby face bias. So people with rounder heads, large eyes, small jawbones, and so forth tend to be rated as more naive, honest, helpless, kind, and warm than individuals with a mature face. A good example of an actor with a baby face was the young Leonardo DiCaprio. In contrast, take the more mature hero, Gary Cooper. Doesn't have a baby face, but a more mature face. Now, the thing that's interesting about this baby face bias is that it goes well beyond people. Advertisers and movie makers routinely make use of this. So consider these two extraterrestrials. One of these has wrinkled skin, rather like a baby, as well as large eyes, small jaw. That one, E.T., looks like somebody you want to save. The other one from Aliens has none of those features. He looks like somebody, or she looks like somebody, who you want to run away from, even though, if you know the story, she's really just protecting her babies. Or take Finding Nemo, where you have the character of this sea turtle with the eyes, the huge eyes facing forward. You might feel that turtles are really kind and cuddly. If you ever look at a real turtle, they don't look anything like this. They really don't look quite so cuddly at all. Even our emoticons make use of this, where a smiley face is a nice round face, and when we want to curse, we give it lots of sharp, jagged edges. Or with our automobiles, one of these looks like the car of someone who's happy with a big smile and eyes, and the other one looks like some sort of alien creature that's going to run you over. All right. You might think, oh, well, maybe you just have a negative attitude toward the Hummer because it's a gas guzzler. But it turns out that of these two companies, it wasn't GMC who was fudging its diesel data. It was the Volkswagen, the company that made the cute, cuddly Beetle. Even companies have this. At one time, Google, whose even its name sounds like a baby word, Google, although it's actually a mathematical term, uses the primary colors and the big round googly eyes of a baby, and has a motto like "Don't be evil." And people give Google all kinds of a free pass that the more adult-looking, angular Microsoft doesn't get. If you want, and of course this extends to actual babies, not baby humans, but at the National Zoo, we had adult pandas there for years who barely got much more attention than any other animal at the zoo. But when they had a baby, the 6-month-old 25-pound Taishan, it was the first surviving giant panda cub ever born at the Smithsonian Zoo. And although the zoo's adult pandas had long been among Washington's top tourist attractions, the public debut of the baby in December unleashed an almost bestial frenzy there. Some 13,000 timed tickets to see the cub were snapped up within 2 hours of being released, and almost immediately began trading on eBay for up to $200 a pair. And in our own more recent times, there's probably no better example of the baby face bias than that of Baby Yoda, which almost single-handedly gave Disney's streaming channel a reliable user base. Here you can see that 223,000 people had liked the original concept art for Baby Yoda. 40,000 were talking about it. According to stories, the director of Mandalorian actually resorted to giving the puppet that was playing Baby Yoda direction because she couldn't help but have this empathic feeling for this perfect baby face. Again, none of this is in line with a logic of attributions. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. In the next lecture, we'll talk about one of the biggest violations of a mentalistic conception of people, a truly dehumanizing way of looking at people that is caused by our stereotypes. So until then,